Have you ever wondered why Nickelodeon, Pee-wee's Playhouse, Miami Vice, your Trapper Keeper all had that same look that just screams the 1980s? I can tell you where that aesthetic came from because today, Rad History is going to talk about the Memphis Group. Welcome to Rad History, a podcast about all things 80s and 90s, the last time things were relatively normal and chill. I'm your host, Brian McCullough. If you close your eyes and picture the 80s, chances are you're not thinking about a single chair or a bookcase. You're seeing a whole vibe. Zigzags and squiggles, teal and hot pink, checkerboards, blobs, plastic laminates that look like TV static. It's the look of Saved by the Bell reruns, Double Dare slime pits, ski jackets, and early MTV bumpers. That visual language didn't just materialize out of nowhere. For a brief, intense window in the early 1980s, a small group of Italian and international designers in Milan basically detonated the idea of good taste. They called themselves the Memphis Group, later branded Memphis Milano, and they only officially existed for about 7 years, but they ended up giving the entire decade its visual accent marks. This is their story, how a tired architect in his 60s gathered a bunch of restless 20 and 30-somethings in his living room, how a Bob Dylan record accidentally named a movement, how a handful of lamps and bookcases leaked out of Milan's galleries and into surfboards, fashion, children's TV sets, and eventually, tech company landing pages. Ettore Sottsass had already lived several design lives before Memphis. Born in 1917 in Innsbruck and raised in Italy, he was trained as an architect and spent the post-war decades doing thoroughly respectable modernist work. In the 1950s and 60s, he became a star designer for Olivetti, where Italian office equipment was being reimagined as a kind of everyday sculpture. His most famous pre-Memphis object is the 1969 Olivetti Valentine typewriter. Bright red plastic, rounded, almost toy-like, carried like a briefcase and photographed with Richard Burton and Elizabeth Taylor. It's been called one of the first office machines that could be sexy, sensual, and fun. A typewriter that kept, quote, poets company on lonely weekends in the country. But even the Valentine didn't go far enough for Sottsass. He'd been to India and the US, seen psychedelic posters, Hindu temples, Las Vegas signage, worlds where color and decoration weren't a crime. He was getting increasingly bored by European modernism's gray seriousness. When I was young, he later said, all we ever heard about was functionalism. It's not enough. Design should also be sensual and exciting. Around him in Italy, younger designers were already rebelling. Groups like Archizoom and Super Studio were imagining anti-chairs and endless grids. Studio Alchemia, founded in 1976, stitched together a more explicit anti-design stance, using furniture and objects to critique consumer culture, and the very idea that design's job was to quietly serve industry. Sottsass floated between these worlds. By the late 1970s, he was working with Alchemia, experimenting with veneers that looked like blown-up bacteria under a microscope, or cheap plastic laminates masquerading as something precious. It was as if he'd proven he could do good taste, and now wanted nothing more to do with that. The origin myth is nicely cinematic. On the evening of December 11th, 1980, in his apartment in Milan, Sottsass invited a bunch of younger designers and architects over to talk about new forms of expression. This wasn't a formal committee meeting. It was more like a cross between a critique session and a house party. People showed up with sketches for lamps, bookcases, textiles. Someone put Bob Dylan's stuck inside a mobile with the Memphis Blues Again on the record player. And according to several retellings, the song kept skipping back to the word Memphis. By the end of the night, this new group had a name. Memphis had the right layered ambiguity. It was Elvis's Memphis and the ancient Egyptian city, and this weird Dylan song about being stuck. It sounded pop and mythic at the same time. The loose circle around Sottsass that night would form the first Memphis collection, unveiled later in 1981. There was Barbara Radice, an Italian design critic and Sottsass's partner, who became the movement's chief theorist and chronicler. She was the rare non-architect in the room and later wrote the key early book, Memphis: Research, Experiences, Results, Failures, and Successes of New Design. There was Martine Bedin, a young French designer fascinated by lamps and by the idea of objects as companions. She would be put in charge of Memphis lighting and being a kind of childlike emotional charge to the group. Michele De Lucci was an Italian architect who had already spent time with Studio Alchimia. De Lucci bridged conceptual radical design and industrial seriousness. A few years later, he designed the Tolomeo lamp, a paragon of elegant functionality while still carrying Memphis's anti-orthodox DNA. There was Nathalie Dupasquier, a self-taught French designer who had moved to Milan in 1979. She became the primary author of the group's surface patterns, the textiles, laminates, carpets, a universe of jazzy dots, lozenges, and squiggles. And there was Peter Shire, a Los Angeles-based potter and sculptor who ran Echo Park Pottery in California. Shire brought in West Coast surf and skateboard sensibilities, cartoonish shapes, bright colors, and an ease with kitsch that didn't feel ironic. Around them, there were others: Aldo Civic, Matteo Toon, Marco Zanini, Shiro Kuromada, Hans Hollein. They were Italian and international architects and industrial designers and artists, all a bit frustrated with what so-called good taste demanded of them. They met again a few months later, this time not just to talk, but to pin things to walls. Hundreds of proposals, chairs, lamps, fabrics, ceramics were thrown onto the table. They weren't trying to refine a style, they were trying to break a mental lock. Modernism, at least in its late 20th century corporate form, preached restraint, clean lines, honest materials, chairs that politely disappeared into the background. Memphis wanted the opposite. Sottsass liked to say that decoration can be a state of mind. In his view, modernism's ban on ornament was just another dogma, no less arbitrary than Victorian frills. The group spent the winter of 1980 and the spring of 1981 working in secret. They designed over 50 pieces of furniture, lighting, and ceramics. They used materials that were considered trashy by the high design establishment, specifically plastic laminate. In the 1970s, plastic laminate was for cheap diners and suburban kitchen counters. It was the material of the working class, not the elite. But Memphis took this cheap material and printed it with custom patterns, squiggles, leopard prints, faux marble, and applied it to expensive handcrafted furniture. It was a deliberate provocation, a shotgun wedding between Bauhaus and Fisher-Price, as critic Bertrand Pellegrin would later describe it. On September 18th, 1981, the group debuted their collection at the Arc 74 Gallery in Milan during the Salon des Mobiles. It was pandemonium. Thousands of people blocked the streets. The crowd was so thick that Sottsass and the designers couldn't even get into their own opening. Inside, the design elite recoiled in horror. The objects in the room looked like they had landed from another planet. There was the Carlton room divider by Sottsass himself. It's the piece you've probably seen 100 times without knowing its name. It's technically a room divider and shelf, but looks like a person with outstretched arms built out of colored planks and triangles. The base is a black and white speckled laminate, shelves tilt at diagonals, and a hollow square perches on top like a crown. Carlton is functionally a storage unit, but its main job is posture. It stands in a room like a cartoon deity. Hey everybody, Brian jumping in here real quick to tell you, if you haven't already, go ahead and hit subscribe to get more great 80s and 90s history. But also, since the show is primarily a podcast, you should know that we don't always do a video for every episode. Sometimes there just aren't enough visuals to add to make a good video. So if you become a fan of these videos, subscribe to the podcast in your podcast app of choice to hear some of the episodes you might have missed. Go to Spotify or Apple Podcasts and just search Rad 80s 90s History to follow and subscribe. There was also Martine Bedin's super lamp. Bedin had been sketching a lamp on wheels as far back as 1978. Memphis gave her a context to build it. The super lamp looks like a little armored animal, a curved fiberglass shell with exposed bulbs arcing along its spine, riding on 4 rubber wheels so you can drag it around. Bedin said she imagined these lamps as friend-like objects that followed their owners. There was the Bel Air armchair by Peter Shire, a bizarre throne that sat on a yellow sphere with an orange backrest that looked like a shark fin slicing through the water. There was the Tawaraya boxing ring by Masanori Umeda, a literal boxing ring with tatami mats intended to be a conversation pit for the home. These objects were difficult to live with. They were expensive, fragile, and loud. You couldn't just put a Memphis lamp in a normal room. It would eat the rest of the furniture alive. As David Bowie, one of the group's most avid collectors, said, "The jolt, the impact created by walking into a room containing a cabinet by Memphis, it was visceral." Bowie understood that these weren't chairs, they were frozen rock songs. The reaction was immediate and polarized. Some saw liberation, others saw a prank. British designer Jasper Morrison remembered his first Memphis sighting as a kind of aesthetic panic attack, talking about cold sweat and shock and panic. And then, almost in the same breath, the feeling that you were suddenly freed by this total rule breaking. More conventional critics were less generous. The work was widely derided as ugly, expensive, and impractical, an assault on good taste that would be forgotten as soon as the decade sobered up. One San Francisco writer famously likened Memphis to a shotgun wedding between Bauhaus and Fisher-Price, a line that stuck because it felt so dead on. But even some of the critics admitted something was happening here that couldn't be ignored. Memphis furniture was media-ready, as one art historian put it, designed almost more for the camera than for the living room. These pieces reproduce beautifully in magazines and on TV. And that's where Memphis really began to spread. If Memphis had stayed in the Milanese galleries, it would have been a footnote in design history. But it didn't. It escaped. The Memphis aesthetic, the clashing colors, the squiggles, the geometric shapes, the black and white stripes, was exactly what the 1980s needed. The decade was moving away from the earthy, hippie tones of the 70s towards something synthetic, digital, and fast. Memphis provided the visual language for this new world. One of the most fascinating vectors for Memphis's spread was through action sports. This connection was largely driven by Peter Shire and the California influence. Shire's Bel Air chair was explicitly inspired by the shark fins of surfboards and the hot rod culture of Los Angeles. When Shire designed the Brazil desk, he used triangular forms that he said linked back to the world of surfing and marine animals. This wasn't just a metaphor. The surf and skate culture of the 80s was looking for a new identity. The radical design of Memphis, with its rejection of rules and its embrace of neon, high-contrast patterns, fit perfectly with the rad attitude of 80s sports. So you began to see the Memphis look filtering into the graphics of surfboards and skateboards. Brands like Vision Streetwear and Santa Cruz began using the jagged geometrics, the floating triangles, and the electric blues and pinks that Sottsass and Dupasquier had pioneered. In the ski world, the muted navies and reds of the 70s were replaced by neon one-piece ski suits covered in abstract Memphis-style confetti patterns. The aesthetic suggested speed, energy, and a break from tradition, exactly what a teenager on a BMX bike wanted to project. The fashion world was the first to embrace Memphis as a status symbol. Karl Lagerfeld, the creative director of Chanel, fell in love with the movement instantly. He was so obsessed that he furnished his entire apartment in Monte Carlo with Memphis pieces. Imagine the scene. One of the most powerful men in fashion living in a palace of gray slate and silicone, surrounded by the boxing ring bed and the totem bookshelves. Lagerfeld wasn't alone. The aesthetic blended into the runways. Missoni and later Christian Dior would pull directly from the Memphis palette. The confetti patterns and the bacterio squiggles became shorthand for modern and edgy. Sports brands in particular jumped on it. The attention-grabbing Memphis aesthetic was quickly picked up by surfing, skateboarding, skiing, and BMX companies. It made sense. These were youth-oriented cultures that already embraced loud graphics and a sense of risk. Skateboard decks and BMX number plates became moving Memphis canvases. Zigzag lightning bolts down the sides, hot pink triangles exploding over teal grids. Ski jackets and snowboards picked up the same language, partly because those patterns popped against white snow and partly because this was the visual shorthand for new and rebellious at the time. Some writers have pointed out a feedback loop between Pacific Coast punk surf graphics and Memphis itself. California designers were already experimenting with neon and splatter effects. With a Californian like Peter Shire in the collective, those influences cross-pollinated, producing something that felt both European and West Coast all at once. By the mid-'80s, you didn't have to know anything about Italian design to be covered in Memphis vocabulary. You just had to be a kid at a skate park, a teenager at a ski resort, or someone buying a loud patterned sweatshirt at the mall. And then there was David Bowie, best known as a musical chameleon, as previously mentioned. Bowie was also a serious design collector. In the 1980s, he quietly amassed a significant Memphis collection. Sottsass cabinets, Delucchi tables, Dupaquier textiles, which he lived with for decades. When the collection went to auction in 2016, the catalogs and press coverage framed Bowie's eye for Memphis as yet another sign of his feel for what was coming next. So if the furniture had struggled as a mass-market product, it was thriving as a visual resource for people whose job, essentially, was to make things look new. If Memphis had stayed confined to galleries, magazines, and a few celebrity apartments, it would still be an interesting footnote. But the true victory of Memphis was its infiltration of the American living room through the television screen. The most famous example is Pee-wee's Playhouse. When Paul Reubens was developing the look for his show in 1986, he tapped into the Memphis energy. The set of the Playhouse is essentially a Memphis showroom on acid. The anthropomorphic furniture, like Cherry the talking chair, was a direct descendant of Martin Bedon's wheeled lamps and the Sottsass totem shelves. The jagged door frames, the crazy patterns on the walls, the sense that every object had a personality, that was pure Memphis. It taught an entire generation of children that design could be fun, weird, and alive. Designed by artists Gary Panter, Wayne White, and Rick Heitzman, alt comics and punk scene veterans, the Playhouse set was often described as pastel Bauhaus, or again, Memphis on acid. Panter has said that Memphis arrived at a moment when designers and illustrators were already mixing retro 50s motifs with punk collage. Pee-wee's Playhouse took that hybrid taste and cranked it to 11. The show's set became an early morning crash course in postmodern design for an entire generation of kids who had never even heard of Sottsass. The influence didn't stop there, though. Look at Miami Vice. The show's logo, with its Art Deco typography and neon gradients, was pure Memphis. The show's interiors often featured glass blocks, pastel neon lighting, and sculptural furniture that echoed the Milanese group's work. Then there was Nickelodeon. The set of Double Dare and the general splat aesthetic of the network in the late 80s and 90s owe a massive debt to Memphis. The geometric shapes thrown into the air look of the obstacle courses, the clashing slime green and orange. It was the Memphis philosophy of bad taste and high energy repackaged for kids. In film, the aesthetic was used to signal the future or the now. In Back to the Future 2, the Cafe 80s is a shrine to Memphis design. In Beetlejuice, when the character Delia Dietz, the insufferable artist, renovates the house, she fills it with jagged, aggressive postmodern furniture that is a clear parody of the Memphis style. By 1987, Memphis was everywhere. It was in the mall food court. It was on your Trapper Keeper. It was on the pattern of the bus seat. And that was the problem. You can only provoke for so long before the shock wears off. From the start, Memphis was a small, self-funded operation. Pieces were produced in limited runs, often by artisanal workshops and priced accordingly. That meant their true mass popularity was always via images, not objects. Meanwhile, the criticisms piled up. To modernist purists, Memphis seemed like selling out to fashion and trend. To younger designers, it was in danger of becoming its own formula. Pick some squiggles, laminate some diagonals, done. Articles talked about Memphis as a symbol of yuppie excess, the interior design equivalent of owning the right stereo system. Sottsass himself grew restless. By the mid-'80s, he had already founded a new studio, Sottsass Associati, and was taking on larger architectural and industrial projects again. In later interviews, he suggested that Memphis had said what it needed to say, that a particular experiment in breaking the rules was complete. The group officially disbanded around 1987-88. The members went on to brilliant, albeit quieter, careers. Sottsass continued to design profound architecture and objects until his death in 2007. Nathalie Dupassier became a respected painter, though her patterns remain legendary. Michel De Lucchi became one of Italy's most prominent architects. And Peter Shire continued to work in Los Angeles, his studio becoming a pilgrimage site for those who love the weird intersection of craft and industry. For a long time, Memphis was considered a joke. In the 90s and 2000s, as the world swung back toward minimalism, think Apple stores and mid-century modern revivals, Memphis was looked at as the ugly decade. It was the hangover we all wanted to forget. But history is a pendulum. Around 2010, the pendulum started to swing back. A new generation of designers, tired of the sterile perfection of the Apple aesthetic, rediscovered Memphis. They saw the joy, the color, and the rule-breaking that their parents had mocked. Christian Dior launched a collection in 2011 heavily inspired by the group. Supreme released skateboards designed by Alessandro Mendini, a close associate of the group. The prices of the original Memphis pieces at auction skyrocketed, with collectors like Bowie's estate selling pieces for tens of thousands of dollars. But the most interesting and controversial revival happened in the tech world. In 2017, Facebook commissioned a design agency to create a new illustration style for its platform. The result was a style called Allegria, but the internet quickly dubbed it Corporate Memphis. You know this style. It features flat, vector-based human figures with non-representational skin tones, blue, purple, green, giant bendy limbs, and tiny heads. They are always happy, always collaborating, always floating in a geometric void of pastel shapes. The name Corporate Memphis was a nod to the 80s group because of the shared love for bright colors and geometry, but critics pointed out a cruel irony. The original Memphis Group was about rebellion. It was about making objects that were spiky, difficult, and emotional. It was about bad taste as a weapon against the establishment. Corporate Memphis, by contrast, is about compliance. It is designed to be harmless. It is designed to make giant tech monopolies look friendly and approachable. It takes the visual language of a punk revolution and turns it into a corporate HR pamphlet. As one critic noted, the original Memphis was anarchistic, while corporate Memphis is bland and conformist. It mimics the form, but misses the soul. So what do you do today with Memphis? If you're not an auction house or a meme page, one way to look at it is to strip away the surface noise and see what the group actually accomplished in its short life. They re-legitimized decoration. Memphis argued in practice that decoration wasn't a crime or a moral failure. Color and pattern could be primary, not just frosting. That opened the door for whole waves of pattern-driven design from 90s club flyers to contemporary textile art. They showed that bad taste is a moving target. What was mocked as trashy in 1982 is now canonical enough to anchor retrospectives and luxury brands. The Guardian, writing about a recent Memphis show, noted that the movement embraced bad taste, but also freed designers from rigid rules. They also proved that images are their own product. Memphis furniture was rarely mass-produced. It was the images that went to scale. The group anticipated a world where an object's photo circulates more widely than the object itself, exactly the world of Pinterest boards, mood boards, and aesthetic TikToks. They also created a shared pop culture reference point. When someone describes something today as very Memphis, a cafe interior, a snowboard graphic, a music video, you don't need a design degree to picture it. That shared mental image is itself a cultural artifact. There's also the more human legacy. Memphis was, at heart, a small group of people who got together in a living room and decided not to wait for permission. The products may look loud and jokey, but behind them is a serious, almost stubborn belief that design can talk about more than ergonomics, that it can reflect joy, irony, politics, and absurdity as directly as a painting or a song. Sottsass once said that design is a way of discussing life, listing off society, politics, eroticism, food, even design itself as part of the conversation. Memphis was his loudest, most controversial contribution to that discussion. Today, over 40 years after the night in Sottsass's apartment, the Memphis Group still casts a long shadow. You can see it in the maximalist interiors of Gen Z influencers. You can see it in the so-called ugly sneaker trend. You can see it every time a designer decides to use a clashing color or a weird shape just because it feels right. The Memphis Group didn't just leave us with a bunch of crazy furniture, they left us with a philosophy. They taught us that design doesn't have to be serious to be important. They taught us that our objects can talk to us, joke with us, and even annoy us. Ettore Sottsass once said, "I don't understand why enduring is better than burning." Memphis burned. It burned bright, hot, and fast, sort of like the 80s. It left a scar on the retina of the world that has never quite faded. Because just like Art Deco conjures up images of the 1920s in New York, and Art Nouveau makes you instantly remember fin de siècle Europe, whether the patterns are on a vintage ski jacket or a rebooted Nickelodeon logo or that comforter on my childhood bed that was a jumble of shapes that my mother has never thrown away. The Memphis Group simply is the visual sensation of the 1980s.